Welcome to Black and Red All Over, an Anglican podcast where we share and celebrate the rich heritage of the Anglican way as found in our confessional texts and conforming theologians. I'm Richard Tarsitano, the pastor of Trinity Anglican Church in beautiful Connersville, Indiana, and I'm joined by my co-host Stephen Wedgeworth, the pastor of Christ Church Anglican in South Bend. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe, tell your friends, and of course, buy them a prayer book. Well, Stephen, it's so good to see you again.
Yes, you too, Richard. Always enjoy getting together.
Yes, we're in the process here in Connersville of restoring a home because we're moving out of the parsonage. It was kind of always the plan once the congregation got to a point where we needed more space, we could kind of move out of the parsonage and use it as kind of a full-time parish hall. So I've been involved in all sorts of home improvements. And one good thing I learned in my time in the Navy is how to paint. And so putting a paintbrush back in my hand, it's sort of like when Theoden gets his sword back in his hand. I feel like I'm complete and ready to go. So I've been quite busy with that. How are things in South Bend?
Very good. Yeah, they're going well. We're getting ready for Holy Week and making plans for all the extra services, the Easter party. So looking forward to that. And yes, my own family is getting over a number of sicknesses. So we've been down and out the last few days. Even myself, I've been sick. So hopefully I'm coming out of it.
Well, I'm sure. And so our boss is the great physician. So we have that going for us. Good to hear. Well, our goal for today's podcast is, I suppose, a bit of a special, as they say. We wanted to kind of talk about Holy Week. We both are preparing for that in earnest. And we wanted to kind of talk about specifically what is kind of the vision of Holy Week in the classical Anglican tradition. Some of this has been sort of moved around in the late 20th century and early 21st century. So you kind of want to give sort of an overview of what that looks like and just kind of have a free will and discussion about what are some of the benefits of the traditional Anglican view of Holy Week. So, Stephen, I thought I'd start off by asking you, what was your sort of biggest kind of shock or sort of the biggest change you had to make in your first service as an Anglican pastor during Holy Week? Were there some preconceived notions that had to be shattered? Were some things that changed in that? What did that look like?
Yes, I was very surprised when I was looking at the Sunday next before Easter, and there's no Palm Sunday to be found. Yes. And it's not even that they don't use the name Palm Sunday, but that they don't even have those readings. The readings you might associate with Palm Sunday are actually used at the beginning of Advent.
That's right.
So
yes, the triumphal entry. Yeah, the triumphal entry is all in Advent, and Palm Sunday, the Sunday next before Easter, is focused on the Passion of Matthew.
That's right. So that was a big surprise. Also, my first Holy Week season, trying to do the numbers in my head, I don't think I had been ordained to be a priest yet. I came in ordained as a deacon, and I waited until synod to be ordained again to the priesthood. So that means that we would not be doing communion services during that time unless we called someone in from out of town, which we did a few times, but it's not every week, obviously. And so I remember that first time doing the Sunday next before Easter, the morning prayer, the second lesson for morning prayer is, 70 verses or something. I mean, it's
that's right.
It's so long. And I just thought, how in the world are we gonna do this?
That's right. It very much changes your kind of idea of what that service's purpose is. Because if you are doing morning prayer and communion, which was, at least having the readings from communion that day, which is really what was intended, you've got a tremendous amount of scripture that's being read in church. I mean, a shocking amount in our modern idea. It's almost a return to the early church's practice of reading a whole book in a sitting. It's gigantic.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, for the communion selection, they have you reading 54 verses of Matthew 27. Most people would think that's a lot.
A lot.
But for the morning prayer reading, you do the entire chapter of Matthew 26, which is even longer.
Right. But it gives you all the context, right?
Yes.
And I think that drives us towards the real difference between the traditional prayer book, the classical England view of Holy Week, versus sort of the Roman Catholic or the kind of post-ecumenical view of Holy Week. whereas the older prayer book thought of Holy Week as being really kind of laser focused on the cross and on atonement, whereas more modern interpretations of this, again, affected by other church traditions, intends to try to reenact the last week of Christ's life, which is a different
Right.
goal.
Yes, that's right. Every day in Holy Week, we'll have you reading one of the narratives of either, Christ being examined before the council and being tried or being crucified. So they're all passion narratives every day of Holy Week.
That's right. And so it can be kind of difficult. You start to see this begin with the 1928 prayer book. And then it just sort of expands beyond that in the late 20th century of trying to sort of have those things exist at the same time, and they don't exactly fit together. It's something has to kind of give in that. I mean, part of it is just time. There's only so many things you can
Right.
focus on. So can you have long, deep meditations on the passion narratives and also have, for example, on Maundy Thursday, have that the focus of that day now becomes the institution of the Eucharist. And in fact, in the 28, you had a separate gospel reading that was available that you could do instead of the Passion narrative. So that's a prime example of once you've made that kind of choice to have kind of a week of reenactment versus really focusing on what one finds in the Passion narratives, something's got to give, and that is the thing that tends to give.
Yeah, that's right. In modern lectionaries, you sort of option A, option B.
Right.
So you can do Palm Sunday or Passion Sunday. And I notice a lot of folks that I just see online, they've actually decided to do both days on consecutive weeks
Yes.
because you can't do them both, at the same time. So do one on one week, one on the next week. And I think that does show you how it's too much to do at the same time. And maybe it's okay to do it 2 different weeks. That's not what we did here. But the fact that people are being required to go that route shows you are kind of working with two different routines, two different paradigms. You're trying to push them all together.
Yeah, and I think the sort of the worst option, which I've seen, is deciding just to skip the passion narrative on Palm Sunday, and
Yeah.
instead focus entirely on the triumphal entry. What happens then is ideally, and again, I think this is a thing we can get into, like how much you can actually get and how important the Holy Week schedule is for Anglicans. But you have a theoretical person who comes to church on the Sunday before Easter and doesn't hear the Passion and doesn't hear Matthew's Passion, doesn't hear the crucifixion narrative. And then because of their work or because of whatever their life circumstances is, they're unable to come Monday through Saturday to any of those liturgies. And then they come on Sunday, the next Sunday, and it's Easter. And so they've essentially been able to circumvent the entire crucifixion narrative going Sunday to Sunday.
Yes.
And I think, we look at church attendance these days, and we both are blessed to have a lot of people who come to our weekday services. But the way in which we generally think of, really serious practicing Christians in this country now are people who come every Sunday, right? And so that's a subset of a group of people who identify as Christians that we think of as being really serious. And if you
Yeah.
have that person coming to your church and you refrain for time's sake or for narrative sake or whatever, the passion narrative on that Sunday, they're just not going to hear it in
Right.
Holy Week. And so you've managed to completely circumvent what the tradition is trying to get us to, hold our faces to the reality of what it means that the God man died for the sins of the world on the cross.
Right. I also think that if you are, using the prayer book strictly, and your prayer book doesn't have the Passion on a Sunday, then it's very unlikely that you're going to be preaching sermons about the Passion.
Right.
Because the Good Friday service, not everybody, I'm sure there are different examples out there, but I would say typically, commonly, the Good Friday service is going to be scripture readings and it's going to be music, but it probably doesn't have a sermon at the Good Friday service. And so that's another reason why it's important to have a passion on a Sunday, a
Right.
passion reading and meditation on a Sunday so that you can preach and teach about it to your people.
And to the widest audience. right? Because
Yes.
the more people are always going to come to that Sunday service than to the Good Friday liturgy. I know we're very blessed to have, people really do come out to the Good Friday liturgy. And I'm going to put a plug in that you absolutely should preach a sermon on Good Friday. In fact, I think the tradition really wants you to, because in the Book
Mhm.
of Homilies, of course, there's two. There's two sermons for Good Friday in there. So there's really no excuse. Matter of fact, we found it very edifying last year. It's the first time I'd ever done this, of reading the two homilies on Good Friday. And they are powerful and beautiful meditations on the death of Christ. The tradition definitely wants sermons on those days. And I think, there's, it's, if there's a sense in which someone says, "Oh, geez, am I going to be preaching on the same thing every single day of the week?" And when I'm like, there's a sort of sense when one needs to check oneself and say, "Is there a point where I run out of things to talk about in the atonement?" I can't imagine that's actually the case in more sort of a permission structure to avoid. I mean, even if you give a 10-minute, 5-minute homily on those days, something for people to have and focus on in terms of the grandeur and the grace that is bestowed upon us through this act. I think that that is a thing that once it sort of becomes all about the things you do that week rather than how we see the gospel exhibited in the atonement, that's where I think things can kind of get off the rail. And I think it's trying to drive us back again and again to the cross, because I think there's a sense in which people get Easter and that's exciting and you get to wear your nice clothes and all the nice things happen and it's all very exciting. And it's the temptation is to skip the cross and jump to the resurrection. And that is something that if you're following the prayer book, you absolutely cannot do. It's just impossible. It really does prevent the worst part of our natures to be in the driver's seat for what we're focusing on for Holy Week.
Yeah, no, that's true. The cross is the center of our religion.
Right.
Obviously, the incarnation and the resurrection are connected to that. We're not picking and choosing, but the cross is the center of it. It's where they all come together. They're all, you wouldn't need to be raised from the dead had you not been crucified, right? Christ is born for the purpose of tasting death. So the
Right.
cross is what holds it all together. So it makes sense that you would have lots of time to read about it, to teach about it, to meditate on it. And the prayer book gives you so much of the word of God.
Yes.
It's another surprise. When I was moving into Anglicanism, I had been exposed to liturgical worship, but more of a modern variety. And the tendency is to minimize the word, not to deny it, not to
Right.
bad mouth it, but to reduce the amount of it and to suggest that really the ritual is more powerful than the communication of ideas and concepts. And so when I got into the older BCP, that just was not the case at all. There's so much of the word of God here, and we're being forced to be patient, to listen to all of these verses and to take them in. And then reading Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, it requires you to sort of say, what's slightly different from that
Right.
presentation to this one? What details are not here that were in the other one? Which are new details? Why?
Yes, and which I find to be a much more serious and space for theological discussion and thought than other options. And I think it's
Mhm.
worth considering if it's important to hold on to, or if there's value in a distinctively Anglican view of Holy Week. I think sometimes the sort of the idea is, well, we need to do what other people have done, or there's some kind of unity that can be found in that, and that is the primary goal. But I think there's something to be said for the unique genius of what we find in Anglican practice and its effect and value over time. That is something that should be cherished and in many ways resurrected, and can be done without being, I hate to sound like the fun police on here, sort of, looking at everything everyone's doing and going, oh, that's odd and strange, or that's new, or that's not in the prayer book. And I
Mhm.
understand that that can be quite annoying. And there are people who do it online who are quite annoying. And I don't think that is our position at all. It isn't one that these certain other practices, I mean, some of them are bring a bit of cognitive dissonance, obviously, to the prayer book when you sort of wholesale bring them over from other traditions. I'm thinking, for example, of like an altar of repose. on Maundy Thursday, where the sacrament is reserved in a little garden in a part of the church. It's very, very difficult to reconcile that with what the articles of religion say about reserving communion. And I've heard people questioning that rightly once they've seen the articles and how does this work within a church. I think bringing that kind of dissonance into laymen's minds is a dangerous thing and not a good idea. I mean, I think it's true for clergy too, but there's sort of a sense in which, yeah, well, maybe a clergyman has kind of worked his way around to why he thinks this is acceptable and right, but it is an unfair thing to lay on the conscience of laymen when we sort of disregard what our formularies say about this kind of thing because we like it or it's interesting or it's a new thing or it's pretty. All those kinds of things can all be true, but is that worth it to create that space for dissidence and that space for conflict within a church? And I think the obvious answer is no, particularly when there's so much already there that if you're actually following, it gives plenty of opportunity for contemplating Gethsemane without having
Yes.
to sort of create kind of your own little Gethsemane, which then leads to, I was going to ask about Good Friday. Oftentimes, that kind of altar repose that gets set up then leads into Good Friday not having, and Good
Mm.
Friday being one of the days where for a lot of people, they don't have communion at all. And I do wonder if that makes a ton of sense given what communion is. I mean, if it's a showing forth of the Lord's death till he comes, boy, it seems like a day in which you would do that is Good Friday. It seemed like a pretty obvious day in which you could have which communion would make a ton of sense. And I certainly have been very edified by that practice at our own church. What are your thoughts on that, Stephen? Does all that make sense to you?
Well, that's right. I think it does. And it's important to remind ourselves that in the BCP, every one of these red letter days, they're assuming that you at least can have a communion service.
Right,
That's the whole point of having communion propers. And so you may choose not to for some reason or other, but you certainly can.
right.
And the idea that you shouldn't, that would be inappropriate, that really is a foreign assumption. And it shows that you're coming from a different point of view, a different background than the prayer book. And I do think it comes from that reenactment mindset.
Right.
Palm Sunday is all about the first day of that sequence of events. And then when you're at Thursday, that's the Lord's Supper day, okay? And then Friday, well, this is a day of sorrow and mourning. And Good Friday is traditionally understood to be a fast day.
Right.
It's a day of contemplating the death of Christ, but that would not require the absence of the sacrament. And you might even can make a case for, fasting the day of until, the
Yes.
sacraments, right? The celebration of the sacrament being kind of the culmination of that.
Oh, I think that's right. I think that's definitely there. And that is another aspect of Anglican Holy Week that's worth examining, how seriously we take fasting. I have and how seriously the Book of Common Prayer takes fasting in those periods, particularly Good Friday, but all the days of Lent are days of abstinence or fasting. And I find it kind of hilarious. I want to be kind here and not be too harsh, but there's sort of a one side of the argument that looks at Anglicans who take fasting seriously and says that we're engaged in rank popery or something or some such thing. But then when I look at the actual tradition that has a pope, and I find that they don't take fasting too seriously. I was again, lots of lovely people, and I don't want to be unkind, but being invited to like a Knights of Columbus fish fry, where it's all you can eat fish and dessert on the day of
Oh, yeah.
fasting, does not strike me as an entirely penitential move, or
No.
ascetic in any kind of real way. So I
Yeah,
think
at Notre Dame, there's a restaurant on campus. It's actually fairly fancy, high end. And so for Lent, they have calamari.
yes. It's funny in the Book of Homilies when it discusses fasting and mentions fish, one of the reasons it gives is because of it supports the economy of England and the fisheries and various things. And I think there's there's a lovely tradition of this. But again, it sort of misses the point that this is supposed to be ascetical and you're eating something cheaper, so you have funds to give alms and oblations for the poor and for those less blessed in this world. So it's kind of a fascinating thing to see it sort of flipped into, oh, it's just the day I eat fish, no matter how expensive that is. And in fact, it may be more expensive than my other meals that I've had that week. It really does start to boggle the mind about whether this is actually an
Yeah.
ascetical practice. And I think that's a
Right.
space in which Anglicans can enter in, particularly traditional Anglicans, with the discussion of fasting in the beginning of our prayer book, and give an example of something more edifying and focused not on self-righteousness or performance, but instead on spiritual warfare,
Right.
and a deep physical remembrance of what our Lord went through.
Right. Yeah, we want to keep in mind the reason we're doing what we're doing and
Yes.
not get tied down to any one particular rule.
Right.
Because yeah, the item of fish changes depending on where you live. If you're not
Right.
on an island,
Lots
then
of fish.
fish may not be such a easy, cheap option. And if you're
Yes.
deep frying it and eating it with all sorts of other stuff, it's not, yeah, it changes. No, I agree. And so, yeah, for Anglican Holy Week, I do think it has a very strong emphasis on the cross. I think it kind of brings all of Lent together. You know, everything we've been building up for, it's coming here. You're going to have more somber tone, I think. That was something when I was in other churches. You know, Palm Sunday is very jubilant, very
Mm.
exciting. And even Monday, Thursday, though it had its elements of some somberness, it was also still, an upbeat spirited day because we're
Right.
talking about the doctrine of communion and things like that. And so the older BCP really does use the whole week to focus on themes of punishment for sin, death, and in that sense it might surprise people.
I think it's also, if we think sort of theologically in that period, because again, this is a shift in the in the Reformation in England. I think there's a strong theme within it all of, as we sort of get rid of the medieval practices and focus more on the Word of God and on the atonement. I think there's a real shift towards the sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice here, right? That it isn't the rituals and other things that were sort of involved in what it kind of could be in the High Middle Ages vision of Holy Week, that it wasn't those things that were making one righteous. It was in fact solely the death of Christ and the sufficiency of his one sacrifice once offered. You can see that in the kind of the narrative sense of this all, where you've gotten rid of all of these other things that were sort of in many ways either distracting or quite frankly had been connected to on a popular level to idolatry.
Yeah.
That's a thing we have to recognize. When we say, "Oh, why did the reformers get rid of palms and ashes and other things and all these other pieces? Were they just jerks? Were they just prudes?" No, they witnessed in real time in their own lives how these things had been used quite idolatrously. Perhaps not
Mhm.
as they were, these maybe they're not being, again, we could say even charitably, not even being used as they were designed for, but that when you open all of this up to the average person, it's easy for them to transform them, even from their intended purpose, into something that is syncretistic and distracts from the central claim of Christianity. And I think this is a
Yes.
wonderful corrective that the sufficiency of Christ is here again and again and again.
That's right. That's right. Another feature of the 1662 is that you have these wonderful Old Testament readings. And these have been lost, to later prayer books. They, have made changes, and I'm not even sure what their selections even are these days. Sunday next before Easter, it's taking you through the plagues of Egypt.
Right.
So we've been building up to this throughout the season. Actually, I've been preaching a lot on the Old Testament lessons. And
Good.
we were in the Joseph saga about Joseph and his brothers. And then we are introduced to Moses and the burning bush. And then Moses goes to confront Pharaoh. And for the Sunday before Easter, we're starting to read deeply about the plagues.
Yes.
I think that's so important because Christ himself, in a sense, is taking on the plagues of God in our stead.
It keeps us focused on the first Exodus, right? If
Yes,
Christ is in his death, is the second Exodus that frees us from the terror of the despotic sin, Satan and death, then of course it makes sense for us to see that type in the liberation of the children of Israel from Pharaoh's tyranny. And of course,
Yes.
you're absolutely right. Instead of Pharaoh and the firstborn of Egypt being put to death, it is the only begotten Son of God who takes that on. And so having those
Yep.
things in parallel is a real master stroke to getting people to see those connections that are so obvious that obviously Paul makes and Peter makes and the New Testament makes a lot.
For Good Friday, you're given an Old Testament reading from Genesis 22. It's the
Hmm.
binding of Isaac. So an incredible Old Testament picture of the sacrifice of the well-beloved son. And then for evening prayer, you're given Isaiah 53, the
Right.
suffering servant who's stricken, smitten, and afflicted for us.
Which is connected with First Peter 2. Right?
Mm,
So there's all these silly arguments about penal substitutionary atonement and how it's nowhere to be found anywhere, and it's you really have to reconcile. Well, what the heck is Peter talking about when he literally calls back to that Isaiah passage, which we're reading together that in that evening prayer
yes,
of Good Friday? Whatever your theory of the atonement is, it has to reconcile for that Peter is 100% interpreting the death of Christ through the suffering servant passages, quoting them for pity's sake.
yes.
So that has to be in there somewhere.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the homily for Good Friday.
Yeah.
It is very much a penal substitution perspective.
Yes, it is unashamedly.
Yeah.
And again, it is a gigantic amount of sophistry when various people who have been Orthodox or Roman Catholics for 13 seconds online start talking about, oh, this was invented. This is just a figment of the Reformation's imagination. When, of course, one can look back in the Fathers, for pity's sakes, and see it. And again, it is obviously alive and well within the New Testament's interpretation of the atonement
Hmm.
event.
Yeah. So, what are you doing for this coming Sunday? What's your Sunday
Uh,
morning going to look like?
so again, when we talk about palms and things, I think it is, of course, worth noting that palms were not a part of the hundreds of years of the Reformed Anglican service. And we want to be careful. I think in the modern period that they are a bit of an adiaphora. I think that wasn't the case at the Reformation because obviously there are lots of critiques of it that show that there are ways in which they were being used superstitiously and in an idolatrous way. The vast majority of places who use them now are not going to use them in that fashion. Now, one could very much make the argument that given we have a historical record of what happens over time in using them, that it would be wise not to sort of ignore that record and sort of pretend like we're so much better than those people and we never have that issue. So we do a bit uh, uh, of a kind of because I grew up, of course, in all the churches that have been affected by the ecumenical movement of having palms, brought in from places, which actually would have been a very strange thing in England. There weren't a lot of palm trees around, so what they tended to have were various branches of other things that were used. Because again, no one had almi that you could call to send to your palms in various times and places. So we do hand out, matter of fact, pieces of evergreen. And again, I would not say anyone else has to do this, or even if we don't bless them per se, but we use it as a way of reminding ourselves of the cross and of focusing on that throughout the week. Sometimes I think you can make an argument that there are physical things that can be handed around, and particularly if they're talked about and used connected to something real and get us back to focusing on what Holy Week is actually about, that they can be useful. But I would say, other than that, our Sunday service, and again, it's not actually a part of the service. We just hand them out at the beginning and
Yeah.
talk about them. The rest of the service is morning prayer, litany, and anti-communion this week. And then for most of Holy Week, we're going to have obviously we have morning prayer every day that week, and then litany on Wednesdays and Fridays. But we also have evening prayer. We tend to do anti-communion every day of the week except Thursday, Friday, and Friday. We have
Mm.
communion along with evening prayer. And so we find that having anti-communion connected to evening prayer tends to make it easier for people to get out and be there rather than in the morning. We do have people who come from the morning services, but more people come to the evening services. So we connect anti-communion to that and have sermons for those services. But you asked specifically about Palm Sunday, the Sunday next before. Yeah, again, I think whatever one can do to make the passion narrative the center and the important part of the service is what one should do. And so we see sort of the handing out of evergreen branches as a way of kind of getting that, particularly for children, get them to kind of see the kind of connection. What's important here is the wood of the cross and our atonement found there. But again, I would never ever demand anybody else do that, or even I would even be open to critiques of that practice. But it was a
Yeah.
good transition from palms to not having palms. I would mention that. Um,
Yeah.
so if someone isn't coming from that distance for that direction, maybe it doesn't make any sense. But it was a good way to continue having something close to that, but also kind of redirecting it toward a more classically Anglican focus.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll be doing a morning prayer in the morning. And then in the evening, I'm going to have everyone come back and we're going to do an evening prayer combined with communion. So
Oh, lovely.
we'll use that sort of rubrical trick that's allowed where you go up through the Old Testament lesson and first canticle, and then we'll pivot into communion.
Yeah,
So since we don't have evening services that often, it's an opportunity that we can do it and say, hey, this is where we're kicking off Holy Week. Morning and evening service. And that way we can have the long morning prayer lesson
oh,
and
that's smart.
then take a break, and then come back and have the long gospel reading.
Yes, no, my people are going to get them both at the same time, but that is a very clever way to do it. I do like that. Yeah, no, it's particularly with your time constraints in your building.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's a thing you have to think about. For those, of course, you know the Christchurch Anglican rents from a beautiful church that you all are at now, but that obviously brings with it thinking through how do I make all these time things
Yeah.
work, and time is always an enemy.
Yes. Yeah. With the morning prayer, I will give something of a homily, but it will be a shorter homily than usual, given how long the readings are. But then when we come back in the evening, we'll have all the time
That's
that
nice.
that we need because there's no conflict then.
Yes, no, I tend to have my sermon on Palm Sunday, on the Sunday next. I tend to have it be a little bit shorter, just because again there is some time constraints there, and it does force one to focus on some things particular. But yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's a tremendous amount of reading they're getting.
Yeah, I was making plans for my sermon. I noticed that in the morning prayer reading, you've got kind of this back and forth between Judas and Peter.
Yes.
So there's different parts of the passage which talk about, Judas being kind of turned off, or he's like angry about the money being wasted on the oil. And then he goes and he betrays Jesus. And then you have Peter saying, "Oh no, I'll never let this happen." He's kind of upset at the very suggestion that he would allow his master to be betrayed. But then, of course, Jesus says, "You will deny me before the cock crows 3 times." So there's that really fascinating parallel or play with Peter and Judas there, and I guess
Oh
the
yeah.
different human reactions we have to Jesus.
And their response to the betrayal, right? Peter weeps bitterly and repents and is forgiven. Judas kills himself,
Right.
right? So I mean, this sort of this idea that I can't be forgiven, so he commits self-slaughter. You have both these two men who both betray him, and then they both respond to that betrayal quite differently.
Yes.
I think there's a perpendicular axis on that is absolutely needs to be that is meant to be there and for us to see. And I think is also very evangelistic and very gospel centered in terms of this. Like, what is I mean, there's no one in the church who hasn't betrayed Jesus, right?
Mm.
And there's no one there who hasn't caused his crucifixion, right? And you know, the necessity of the crucifixion is because of our sin. The only question is, what is our response to that? Is a response to literally kill ourselves in our sin and disorder and rebellion, or to weep bitterly and to repent and live for Christ? I think that's 100% there, and I've definitely preached a sermon of such a nature.
Yeah, very good.
This is one benefit of this is one benefit of having these readings every year, right? And of course, sharing them with the saints in the past as well is that you can benefit from talking through them with other clergy and reading back to what did Augustine preach on this, and like if where it's such a benefit to have this older lectionary than to be sort of juggling various years and hoping you're kind of around there and kind of being off on a modern island.
Yes, yeah, there's so many neat details, and the idea that you would run out of stuff to say is kind of incredible because you just would have to not be looking closely. There's a new thing on every paragraph, and you get another chance next year.
Yeah, it's very much a you like a personal problem, not a problem with the text at all.
Yeah.
One thing I think that gets left up when people think about Holy Week is the Psalms. If you're following the daily office through Holy Week, which I hope everyone is doing it all the time, don't get me wrong, but the Psalms are such a constant companion and really kind of gives you such I would say both an emotional and a theological depth, right? It is your prayer voice as you're going through Holy Week, and to sort of those tend to get kind of skipped for other sort of practices or sort of marginalized. And again, if the passion narratives are the heart of Holy Week, then our response to them so often is going to be found in the Psalms, and not
And
just little pieces, but all of them.
there are proper psalms for Good Friday as
There
well.
are.
Psalm 22, Psalm 40, Psalm 54, Psalm 69, and Psalm 88. And when you look at those psalms, it's obvious why they were chosen. You know,
Right.
songs of feeling abandoned by God, bearing his judgment, crying out to him, uh, asking him to hear you and rescue you, but in your temporal experience, not being certain that he
Right.
has. I mean, that's exactly what's presented to us with Christ on the cross. We know eventually what will happen. We know how Psalm 22 ends,
Right.
but the beginning is still a real human emotion.
That's right. It grounds us in the human reality of being in time and suffering, but reminds us again and again and again that glory is coming from that suffering, which is just such a constant refrain of the Christian life. And in fact, I think Paul is so bold as to say that you really can't get glory except through suffering.
Right.
It's just these things are, if sin is death, suffering is glory in a fallen world. And I think there's no better way to see that work itself out than through the Psalms, which are dealing with suffering, the real human suffering that's true and unavoidable. And then, of course, linking that to our suffering servant in the Old Testament readings, and then linking it to the great act of glory coming from suffering on the cross. It's all there.
Now,
You're
there's
not missing. Oh,
one
good.
other thing that might be of interest or worth talking about with Good Friday, the collects for Good Friday. You get quite a few. And so there are, let's see, you're repeating the one that goes throughout Lent. You're doing that every week. But for Good Friday, you have one, two, three, four collects. And the third of those collects has been controversial over the
Yes.
years because it asks that God would convert sinners, but then it also gets specific.
Yes.
It says, have mercy upon all Jews. Now, in the original 1662, it said Turks.
Right.
The International Edition has touched that up to Muslims, Jews, Muslims, unbelievers, and heretics.
Right.
And I know there are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with that today, praying that way. But I think it's important
Yes.
because it is a prayer that they be converted. It's not a prayer of anger or antagonism against them. And naming them is appropriate because it's one thing to say convert all those people out there, but then put a name to it. Which people? That way, we're being specific, and it's naming certain very important and numerous classes of people whom we should desire to see converted to Christ.
Right. And I think it's specifically people who don't have Christ, right?
Yeah,
If the whole week has been about the sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice for sin and it's the only path to salvation, then we would be cruel and insane not to mention and pray earnestly to God that those who have separated themselves from Christ and really a sort of a tenet of their religion refuse to acknowledge the nature of what Christ has done on the cross, that they be converted and believe in that, because there's no other salvation outside of it.
yeah,
That's charitable and mercy and asking for mercy.
right.
I don't think it shouldn't be offensive at all. I just think in our particular age where claims of exclusivity are often met with shock and pearl clutching and horror, I think it would be right to say who had a more clear-eyed view of what was necessary for human flourishing, those who were willing to call out those who had chosen not to follow Christ, or is it better to let our neighbor suffer and die in their ignorance and separation from the living God? I think that
Yeah.
that should be an easy call.
And for people in your congregation, they may not have it all sorted out. I mean, how easy is it for Christians to sort of think, well, Jews, of course, they're saved.
Right.
And I said, well, no, unless they come to Christ,
Right.
just like others, they would not be saved. And so having this said specifically is important for evangelism.
I think that's right. It's a statement that can't be ignored on such a solemn day. And I think it's also the advantage of an older wisdom. I think it's easy sometimes to be blinded by our own time and the political necessities of life in a pluralistic nation, and sort of change that into the actual religious doctrinal tenets of your faith. That's a thing that should be avoided at all costs. And having an older liturgy that's not suffering under that chronology can be quite useful. And I think this is another case where that shows itself.
And it does mention several different groups, so I think
Yes,
that clears it from the charge of just being kind of mean-spirited, anti-Semitic. It's talking about all sorts of people, but it does name names. I've also run into a number of kind of Anglicans of different stripes who sort of flirt with universalism,
sure.
and so this would also be an important corrective to those folks. The prayer book does not share universalistic theology.
Yeah, it's not dispensationalist and it's not universalist. And again, those are all, I think there's a sense in which we talked about penal substitutionary atonement earlier, as there's a kind of sense in folks where they're just sort of trying to throw off all of either Western Christianity or what they incorrectly perceive as being unique to Protestant Christianity, and they come out the other end in these very odd pretzel shapes, and one of them is universalism. And you will see that, particularly in certain small segments of the Anglican way. I would not say it's mainstream at all, but it is out there. Um, and again, it is oftentimes this strange, misplaced notion that in order to recover the early church's faith, one must listen exclusively to Gregory of Nyssa and Origen, and one of the Hart brothers, and that's the key to orthodoxy. And I find myself unconvinced, and blessedly, the prayer book certainly just doesn't allow it. It's just not there, and forces us
Yeah.
to remember that it's a minority opinion, and one that one better be very sure about when he goes to meet the judge. Again, universalism doesn't make a ton of sense if you focus on the atonement for a week. Why was this necessary if, at the end of the day, none of it was needed?
Mm, all right. And we can see again and again that the prayer book does reinforce doctrine.
Yes.
Sometimes there's an unfortunate pairing off, and your more reformed Anglicans say, no, our doctrine, it comes from the articles, not from the prayer book. And I don't see any reason to take that approach. I think it's very, very much the case that the prayer book teaches doctrine. You just have to get used to it, learn how it does it, and recognize it.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that came from 19th century, 20th century fights between evangelical Anglicans and Anglo-Catholic Anglicans, where the evangelical Anglicans will say, "Oh, it's all about the articles," and the Catholic Anglican would say, "No, it's all about the services of the prayer book." And so they developed this weird hermeneutic for thinking about doctrine. And so I think you're absolutely right. It's a silly one and not real or not true. And so would we be wise in the 21st century, as in many cases, to avoid falling into the pitfalls of those late 19th century battles and instead transcend them? This is actually something that, going back to the older prayer books, really helps us to do, quite frankly. So perhaps we'll, as we're nearing our end, we'll get to a fun one. Stephen, what is your official position on foot washings? I will start with mine, because it's unfair for me to throw that on you, so to speak, out of the blue. I very much hope that when I meet my Lord, that he will forgive me for my utter hatred of foot washings. I don't know. Again, this is not included in any of the prayer book services, washing a bunch of people's feet. I find, again, perhaps this is just me being insufficiently Catholic or some such thing. But I find it all foot washings to be quite unedifying. I don't want people touching my feet. I don't want to touch anyone else's feet. And maybe someone
Yeah.
says, "Well, look, there it is. There's your own haughtiness and your own and your own demons. You need to expel through more foot washings." But I'm very blessed that the prayer book does not force me to wash people's feet.
Yes. No, I've never been in a situation where it was a part of a gathered worship service. When I was a kid, we did it in a Sunday school setting.
Wow. Okay.
And that's I think that's fine, something just to teach people. Now, our diocese, one of the things that our bishop does is that the bishop, washes the feet of those people being ordained.
Yes.
And I think that that's a spin-off of the older English tradition where there would be a foot washing I think the bishop would wash the king's feet, or maybe even the opposite. The king would wash the bishop's feet. But
That sounds right.
there was some English practice where people of very high rank would wash feet, not as part of a regular worship service, but
Right.
on a unique basis. So I think that that's kind of interesting, but no, I wouldn't do it in a church service. It doesn't fit any way that I like. I don't see where you would put it. It makes sense. It seems like it would get very unwieldy and out of control. And do you want everyone washing everyone else's feet? That's really going to be hard to handle. My guess is you're just most people are just selecting a few people to do it, kind of just as a typical approach. But
And I,
someone
oh,
pointed out
good.
to me though, the first BCP of any kind to include foot washing. It is the 2019.
That's right. That's right. I know. Yes, which is something. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse too much. I think there's a certain cultural aspect to foot washing. As a pastor in the year of our Lord 2026, I am very careful about how I interact with my body on other people. This was true when I was a teacher. For example, when I was teaching middle school, I never hugged female students. Now, could that have been a perfectly innocent thing? Sure, of course. But in our world, there's just too much stuff that can come out or happen. Any kind of perceived thing can destroy you and can destroy people's lives. And I really have difficulty separating. There's just kind of an intimacy to touching people's feet. That again, you could say, oh no, it's just this practice that shows how humble the minister is, and he's washing people's feet. I don't know. There's just something that just seems like an opportunity for bad things to happen from that in this time period of am I touching a female parishioner's feet enough? Is it too much? What do we do? It just nah. I just to be I don't even want to open this potential
No,
can. And blessedly, it is I'm preserved by just doing what the prayer book says.
right. You can think of a listener might object, say, well, hey, Jesus did it, right? It's
Yes.
there. But that's where we want to pay very close attention to the specifics. Well, he did it with all male
Yeah.
disciples, not in a public worship setting. Yeah. And I think it was a cultural thing that we don't even do anymore. I mean,
Right.
the washing of feet is just it's not a part of American society ever. And so I'm always I'm always really careful with things like customs. We don't want to make customs into sacraments. If they make sense, if they've continued, if they've been handed down, if we still do them, then great. But if they really aren't around anymore, then the only time you bring them back is for a church service. It's going to naturally give the impression that it's basically a sacrament. So
That's true.
I
I didn't think
tend
about
to
that.
yeah, I tend to stay away from that sort of thing. If you're lighting a candle just to produce light, nobody thinks twice about it, no big deal. But if you have this whole thing about the candle, right? You have to light it to the left and to the right, and you bow before it, and you do this and you do that.
You
Wait a
can't leave
minute.
till it's out.
What's going on with this candle? You've introduced a substantially new item under guise of just decoration or custom.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's something we want to be very careful with.
That's right. That's right. I'm reminded of that hilarious correspondence between Cranmer and Knox regarding kneeling to receive communion. And Knox, as I remember, said that we should, receive as the apostles did. They didn't kneel. We shouldn't receive in this way. And Cranmer's response was, if we all sat at leisure and received the communion as they did then, because the tables were lower and they had sort of settees, he said we would all look like Turks, and that would not be edifying for worshiping in 17th century, or excuse me, 16th century England. And I think that is an important thing to think about when you're sort of importing a very, very different culture into your church. And what is the message of that? And does that tend to sort of obscure everything else and make for very strange and really kind of alien concepts that then so just do dominate everything within it? All right. Any other thoughts, Stephen, for today?
Well, I do want to make sure we end on the fact that I very excited about Holy Week. I really
Yes.
enjoy it. It's definitely the highlight. It's hard to imagine in our world, but this is actually supposed to be the biggest of all the holidays.
Yes.
Holy Week leading up to Easter. This is the most major of the feasts, bigger even than Christmas.
Yes.
And so I think it definitely deserves that sort of emphasis and attention, and we'll try our best to celebrate it with enough gusto.
That's right, right. It is many services. There's a lot going on, and it can be a trial. But it is. You're absolutely right. Without Good Friday, without Easter, without our Lord's death, resurrection, and of course ascension, without those things, there just is no religion. There's no Christianity, and so it is only meet and right that this is the high point of our year and should be reflected in the amount of sacrifice we're willing to bestow upon it. And blessedly, the Book of Common Prayer really expects a lot of us. It doesn't suffer from low expectations. It wants us to really be there at the cross day in, day out until, of course, the victor of death himself is revealed on Easter Day and we can celebrate and know we are the saved ones. Yeah, no, it's an incredible thing. Yeah, I am very much looking forward to it as well. It's amazing. So, as I say, I think that's right. We want people to know that we're excited about it and love it, and they should too. And all right, well, I think we've gone about our time. We'll end here. So if you enjoyed today's show, as I say, there's lots of ways to comment on things and follow things and tell your friends and all of that. You can also tweet at me at God Remembrancer. I'm also on Facebook. Stephen is also on Facebook, so you can bug him there. And also, if you have questions, you can leave them in the comment section, and we will do our best to address them. But in any event, God bless you all, and thank you so much, Stephen. This has been wonderful.
Yep, absolutely.